that 96 to 98% of Americans believe in an afterlife of some form, of some manner, a very, very high percentage. So I kind of put the religious factor aside a bit, and I came to conclude that the primary difference was one of materialism. I mean, we're told in ways we have a very materialistic society. Obviously, the patients that were being cared for in Mother Teresa's hospice were not, did not have a wealth of possessions. But I think there's a deeper meaning to that. And by materialistic, I mean that when you invest your self-worth or your idea of yourself in external things, that's what I would define as materialism. So if your sense of who you are is derived from your job, your position, your intellect, your attributes, all external things that are taken away from you when you die, that death can be a really scary thing. And so the reason I mention that and talk about this, and I think there's an importance in that message, is because one of the reasons that we're here today is that we all know to a large extent the end-of-life care system is broken in this country. It's one of the most shameful, aspects of our society that we can point a finger to. And you probably all know the statistics. There was a study from the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the study's a few years old, but it's a shocking statistic that 50% of hospital patients experience moderate to severe pain in the last 3 days of their life. 50%. Now, is that getting better? Is it getting worse? I don't know. We hope it's getting better. But then again, when you have legislative initiatives for prescription drug monitoring, so pharmacists tie in by computer pain medications that are issued so some drug enforcement official somewhere can look at it, does that make doctors more reluctant to give the necessary pain relief that patients have a right to and the patients deserve? I don't know the exact answer to that question, but some physicians certainly tell me that's the case. Now, these are not easy problems to address. If they were easy issues, if they were simple, if they didn't have complexities to them, then we wouldn't be here talking about this. I mean, the fact is, I guess, that there is abuse of pain medication, and people who go to 4 or 5 different doctors because they're hooked on pain medication, maybe that's a legitimate societal problem. But isn't someone thinking that by making this war on drugs some sort of national schizophrenia, that by condemning drugs on the one hand, it has the effect of also making it more difficult for people who have legitimate use for drugs, for pain relief, to get them when they need them. And I'm sure many of you know from your hospice experience, if you have a cancer patient dying who has been on opiates for a while, the doses of opiates that they may receive on the last couple days of their life are enormous. And many physicians themselves don't understand that. So part of what Compassion and Choices does, part of what hospice does, part of what I hope the legal work that I have done through the Schiavo case does, is raise public awareness, raise public consciousness, have people start talking about the fact that yes, we're all going to die. 110 years from now, or 115 years from now, everyone on this planet is not going to be here anymore. It's just a fact of life. But we do live in a materialistic, death-averse, youth-seeking culture. And to the extent that that underlies so much of the opposition in these type of cases, and it makes dying with dignity so much more difficult in this country, there's no simple fix. It's people becoming educated and becoming aware, one by one, and hoping that spreads. And I hope that that is one of the saving graces of the Terri Schiavo case, in that it has increased and helped to increase public consciousness in that area. Now, I know many of you came to hear more about the Terri Schiavo case than my particular ideas of why I think we have such a poor system of caring for the dying. And there are some very important issues in that regard. One thing that I was struck is that, in this case, of course, is that you had a dysfunctional family situation. Now, those of you who work in hospice and, okay, this reminds me of I don't know if you've ever seen this t-shirt. There's a t-shirt of this cavernous auditorium. And there are two people sitting in it, and you see all the empty chairs, and on the bottom of the t-shirt it says, Convention of Children from Functional Families. But even among the spectrum of function and dysfunction, the Schiavo case in many ways was a family dispute. And I was struck in taking the depositions of Terri's parents for the first time, and that's the first time I had met them in person. And that is also a challenging thing to do. It's hard to examine under oath and look someone in the eye when they're looking back at you and saying, "You're trying to kill my daughter." But I learned something very interesting in taking the depositions, is that the beliefs expressed by Terri's parents on the record were, to me, so bizarre and out of the mainstream. And by that, I mean this. I asked them, if you were in charge of Terri's medical care, let's assume that it was established beyond any doubt that she has no consciousness, will never have consciousness, and it was her wish not to be kept alive by artificial feeding in this situation. If she required open heart surgery to stay alive, what would your decision be? And they said, we'd have the surgery performed on her. Said, let's say she developed diabetes and had to have a limb amputated in order to survive. What would your choice be? And it was the father who said, we proceed with the amputation. And I said, well, how about the other leg? Absolutely. And an arm? Absolutely. I couldn't even bear to ask myself about the last remaining limb in this hypothetical scenario. And I asked her mother, I said, well, if I know you don't agree that these are Terri's wishes. I know that. However, let's assume that it's undisputed she didn't want to be kept alive this way. This is the same hypotheticals that I had given. I said, why is it that you would keep her tube fed and put her through that medical treatment? And her answer was, that's because that's what I would want for myself. Now, I'm not making this up, obviously. This is in the record. This was her answer. And I was, and I asked them, my next question, well, why is it that you'd want that for yourself? And she said, well, I believe that the body should be sustained by all treatments possible because it's God's will that we maintain life as long as possible. And that, by the way, you might have heard the word vitalism in some of the literature about this case. That is that there's a very small but vocal and well-funded minority in the country that believes in vitalism, which is, I believe, so far outside of the mainstream of the values in this country. And if you stop, not this group, but if we went outside and stopped 99 people on the corner and said, hey, if you were like Terri Schiavo, would you want to be kept alive that way? Well, maybe one person, maybe two would say, oh yeah, sure, keep me alive, but the overwhelming majority would not. And so one of the components, because I asked myself this question, again, within the family, why is there so much opposition generated? And part of it was ideological. There were other reasons too, which I can't go into because of the time I have available, some pretty disturbing. But that ideological component, of course, was picked up upon by the surrogates and supporters of Terri's parents and siblings who funded tremendous amounts of money into this case in opposition, which is their right. We have a right of freedom of expression. Those who have their views can promote them. But it was a frightening experience for me in October of 2003, when Terri's feeding tube had been removed on October 15th, and the Florida legislature passed Terri's law 6 days later. I think we started out with the thought, because we knew when the opponents ran out of their judicial options, that they were going to try some legislative avenue here. And we kept saying, oh, there's no way they can get a bill passed in 1 day or 2 days or 3 days or something like that. And and many of you know the story, what happened. There was a massive electronic lobbying effort through telephone and emails in Tallahassee that basically took their system offline, that overwhelmed them. And when it looked like something was going to pass, I had a conversation with Senator Jim King, who was then the president of the Florida Senate. And Senator King, I was on the phone with him the morning of the day that Terri's law was being passed. And Senator King is one of the architects of Florida's living will statute and statutory right to die law. And he was a big proponent and supporter, because he went through the death of his father. That was a real awakening experience for him. So he was a very supportive member. And I said, Senator King, first of all, thanks for talking to me. And I said, we know what's happening here is not right. He says, I know it's not right. And I said, is there anything that I can do to help you in your efforts? Is there some way to derail this process? And I remember so clearly, with anguish in his voice, he said to me, there's a big boulder rolling down a hill, and the only thing any of us can do is get out of the way. Now, at that moment, I felt some of my liberty being lost. And here was a law that basically says the legislature can veto any judicial decision they don't like. Or actually, the legislature empowers the governor to veto or disregard, void any final judicial decision that displeases him. That's how blatantly unconstitutional that law was. The Senate staffers said, this is unconstitutional. I mean, none of that made any difference under that onslaught, that boulder rolling down the hill. It was scary. As a lawyer, I love the law. I respect the rule of law. I see the value of the rule of law in our society. And, Benjamin Franklin said, liberty is not taken away all at once. Your liberty is taken away little by little until one day you turn around and it's gone. And so this experiment in democracy that we have is a living, breathing thing. Separation of powers is not some sort of abstract concept that you just learn about in 4th grade civics. It's something that has to be maintained and supported by individuals, whether they're public servants, they're politicians, they're judges, they're lawyers, or the average citizenry. And so we faced that day. That was October 21st. Terri's law was passed. And I immediately filed a suit in the civil court for a declaratory judgment declaring the law unconstitutional and seeking an immediate injunction. Because as we were doing that, Governor Bush sent the state police, or actually the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to hospice. These were armed men who called hospice beforehand and said, we're coming to get Terri, and don't stand in our way. And they had an ambulance, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement came without her guardian's consent, without her consent, wheeled her away to a local hospital where a feeding tube was to be inserted. And at that time during transport, we were in court before Judge Baird, Douglas Baird, who eventually ruled Terri's law to be unconstitutional a number of months later. And I remember standing in front of Judge Baird, arguing that the most grievous of crimes was about to occur to Terri Schiavo, that her personal rights, her body, her liberty, her right of self-determination was going to be trampled on, and that he was the only one at that time who could stop that. And I remember standing up before the bench and making my argument, saying, but in essence I said to you that separation of powers is just not a doctrine. Is that it takes real courage to stand up and do what is necessary at that time. So he took, and he lowered his head, and I thought I saw a little water in his eyes. So we took a break and we went out. And came back in, and he did not grant the injunction. And the reason he did not grant the injunction, I believe, in that climate, was I think he was genuinely concerned that his order would not be enforced. And when you have courts that don't have armies, and where judicial decisions are to a large part obeyed in this country through a societal consensus, is that what we need to do? The last thing a judge wants to do is enter an order that he believes isn't going to be obeyed. Now you know the rest of the story in as far as the constitutional litigation is concerned. Now I want to say a few words here, and I think one of the things about Schiavo is that we can't lose. There are a lot of lessons to be learned in this case. And I think the perception of the general public is, well, everything turned out all right at the end. Well, let me tell you, it was very, very close to turning out the other way. This case easily could have turned the other way many, many times, and especially in the last 2 weeks. And it's our duty as citizens to be vigilant, to look at what happened in this case, and to not let it slide by in the public memory. And we need to look at the executive branch, the legislative branch, but also the judicial branch. I know the judges and the courts came out to be the heroes in this case, following the rule of law at the end of Schiavo. But, in my opinion, the constitutional crisis that was created in Schiavo was in part a making of the judiciary. And this is the reason. I filed the suit to discontinue Terri's artificial life support in April 1998. The last court order issued in her case was on March 30, 2005, one day before she died. It should not take 7 years to litigate and adjudicate and enforce a citizen's constitutional right. And what happened in this case, over and over again, is that judges stretched the law, sometimes stretched it really, really thin, to entertain claims of the parents and their surrogates again and again, claims that were already raised, reviewed, tried, retried again and again, allowed them to re-raise those claims and entertain them. So I think there was a perception on the part of the legislature and the executive branch of government, there was a perception that there was something wrong happening with this case in the judiciary. That the indecision, the chronic indecision of the judges, not to adjudicate Terri's rights, which they did years ago, but to enforce it, to them exhibited some sort of doubt or unease on the part of the judiciary. And so I think that in our examination of how our branches of government worked in this case, that it bears us looking at the courts and why it took so long to finally resolve this case. There were, in the Intermediate Appellate Court in Florida, there were 23 applications for appellate review. I mean, I feel I can write briefs in my sleep by this point in time. I have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to close on this point. I started by talking about the culture wars. And that phrase it almost sounds a little trite. It's almost has a comic tinge to it, but it's not. It's really not funny, the extent that this country finds itself in division. I have a friend, a very good friend, who was a Kerry supporter, and after the election, she was so profoundly affected. Not only didn't she take her Kerry for President sign down off her front lawn, she shrouded it in black. It was as if she was so deeply disaffected by the process that she was in a state of mourning. And so we have this division in this country, the red-blue division, let's say the urban coastal that views the other side as these narrow-minded religious fundamentalists who are so certain of their beliefs that they try to impose it on everyone else. And then you have the red interior side who views the other side as these advocates of this unwholesome mass culture being shoved down their throats and who don't respect their religious beliefs. Now, one thing both sides have in common is, I think, a growing intolerance of each other. And that is not a good thing. For me, on a personal level, one of the greatest challenges in this case was trying to remain open-hearted and not hating the people who I was dealing with. That was a very, very difficult... I'm glad I wrote that book, because I said, hey, what did I write about that? I need some help. Because it is, I'll be honest, religious fundamentalism gives me the willies. It's very difficult for me to relate to a mindset that relegates to hell everyone else who doesn't express their belief in God or relationship with Spirit in a different way. And I've met many of these people. I've debated with them on television. But I think it's important to try to bridge that rift and that gap and find some common threads of understanding. You know, in a way, they are our brothers and sisters. And if we can't find threads of common understanding with our brothers and sisters, how can we even begin to weave those threads of understanding with people who really disagree with us in this world globally? I mean, if there's a war on terrorism, whether you want to call it a war or not a war, there are many people on this planet who hate and despise our values, or what they perceive or mistakenly perceive to be our values, who want to destroy us. Now, I'm not saying we don't have to protect ourselves, but you can't bomb hatred into oblivion. You can't bomb ideas out of existence. You know, I believe that eventually there has to be some sort of common threads of understanding that we can reach out to and reach out with everyone. And so I guess the point I'm making, which I saw in the Schiavo case, and I started by talking about how disheartened I was, is that if we can't even do that in our own country, if we can't even begin in some way to bridge that rift in our own country, how can we begin to do it elsewhere? So, for me, that was my